The autumn rain fell steadily on the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, as General Heinz Guderian emerged from what would be his final conference with Adolf Hitler as Chief of the General Staff. His face pale and drawn with the recognition that he had just witnessed not strategic planning, but the delusions of a man who had completely lost touch with military reality. It was March 1945, and as Guderian walked through the bunker corridors past officers who avoided meeting his eyes, he carried with him the certainty that had been building for months but had crystallized in that disastrous meeting. Hitler was not merely making strategic errors or tactical mistakes that competent subordinates might correct. He was actively leading Germany toward total destruction with a combination of denial, rage, and nihilistic determination that made rational military planning impossible and ensured that the wehrmacht would be annihilated rather than preserved for any future purpose. The realization had not come suddenly to the German High Command, but had accumulated gradually through countless instances where Hitler's orders contradicted military logic, where his assessments bore no relation to battlefield realities, where his responses to crisis consisted of rage at subordinates rather than rational adjustment of strategy. For many officers, the recognition had been growing since Stalingrad, when Hitler had forbidden the Sixth Army to break out despite military necessity being obvious to every professional soldier. For others, the turning point had been Kursk, where Hitler had launched an offensive that intelligence suggested was compromised, yet continued even as it became clear the operation was failing. For some, the final proof had come during the Battle of the Bulge, when Hitler had committed Germany's last operational reserves to an offensive that could not succeed, even if it achieved tactical surprise. But by early 1945, with Soviet forces on the Oder River less than 70 kilometers from Berlin and Western Allied forces across the Rhine and driving into Germany from the west, the realization was becoming universal among those senior officers who retained capacity for objective assessment. Germany was not merely losing the war, it was being systematically destroyed by a leadership that refused to acknowledge reality and that made decisions based on ideology, wishful thinking, and personal psychology rather than military necessity. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's most loyal military subordinate and chief of OKW, had watched the deterioration of Hitler's strategic thinking with mounting concern that he lacked the courage to voice. Keitel had built his career on absolute obedience to Hitler, had earned the derisive nickname La Keitel, the lackey, from more independent-minded officers who despised his sycophancy. But even Keitel, whose default response to any Hitler directive was enthusiastic agreement, could see by early 1945 that the orders being issued bore no relation to what German forces could actually accomplish. Hitler would point at maps and order counter-offensives by armies that no longer existed, demand that divisions hold positions when those divisions had been reduced to regimental or battalion strength, insist on operations that required fuel Germany did not possess and air support the Luftwaffe could not provide. When staff officers attempted to explain that the forces in question lacked the capability for assigned missions, Hitler would rage about defeatism, about generals who lacked faith in National Socialism, about the German people proving themselves unworthy of his leadership. These rages had become more frequent and more detached from reality as the military situation deteriorated. In earlier years, Hitler's anger had at least been directed at specific failures or perceived betrayals, commanders who retreated without authorization, units that performed below expectations. By 1945, the fury was more generalized and more irrational, directed at the objective reality that German forces could no longer prevent Allied advances, that tactical competence could not overcome the overwhelming material superiority arrayed against Germany on all fronts. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations at OKW, had developed a technique for managing these confrontations, presenting information in carefully crafted language that minimized bad news while creating the impression that Hitler's strategic vision was being implemented. Jodl would describe retreats as tactical adjustments, would characterize catastrophic defeats as temporary setbacks, would frame the loss of entire armies as regrouping for future operations. This verbal gymnastics allowed briefings to proceed without triggering the rages that made communication impossible. But it also meant that Hitler received increasingly distorted information about the actual military situation. The system had created a feedback loop of delusion where Hitler issued orders based on his fantasy assessment of German capabilities. Those orders were acknowledged by staff officers who knew they could not be implemented. Field commanders either ignored the orders or attempted token compliance before doing what military reality required, and reports back to Hitler were sanitized to avoid acknowledging the gap between directive and execution. The result was a command structure that functioned more as theater than as actual military organization, where the forms and rituals of command were maintained even as the substance dissolved. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, one of Hitler's favorite commanders and a true believer in National Socialist ideology, represented the most dangerous dimension of the descent into irrationality. Schörner had earned Hitler's favor through fanatical loyalty and willingness to execute any order regardless of its military sensibility. He enforced Hitler's no-retreat policy with brutal discipline, hanging soldiers accused of desertion, shooting officers who suggested withdrawal, driving his men forward in attacks that accomplished nothing except producing casualty lists. Hitler promoted Schörner and commanders like him, while removing or sidelining officers who demonstrated independent judgment or who raised concerns about the feasibility of directives. This selection process ensured that the command structure was being purged of competent professionals and filled with ideological loyalists who would implement suicidal orders without question. By early 1945, many of the best remaining commanders had been relieved, arrested, or had committed suicide rather than continue participating in what they recognized as Germany's orchestrated destruction. The Nero Decree of March 1945, Hitler's order for the destruction of German infrastructure to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, represented perhaps the clearest evidence that Hitler had abandoned any concern for Germany's future beyond his own survival or death. The decree ordered the destruction of industrial facilities, transportation networks, utilities, food supplies, everything that the German population would need to survive in a post-war environment. It was not a military order designed to hamper enemy operations, but a nihilistic directive that revealed Hitler's conviction that if he could not have his 1,000-year Reich, then Germany itself should be destroyed. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, and one of the few remaining officials with both access to Hitler and the courage to oppose him directly, worked to ensure that the Nero Decree was largely ignored by commanders and civilian officials who understood that implementing it would doom Germany's population to starvation and chaos after the war's end. But the fact that Hitler had issued such an order, that he was willing to destroy Germany rather than see it survive his defeat, demonstrated to the High Command that their Führer's thinking had crossed into territory that could only be described as madness. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding the defense of Berlin's approaches, found himself in the impossible position of being ordered to defend the capital with forces that existed primarily on paper. Hitler's directives referenced divisions and corps that Heinrici knew had been destroyed or reduced to fragments weeks earlier. The reserves that Hitler insisted were available for counterattacks consisted of boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm, formations that lacked training, equipment, and any realistic capability to stop the Soviet steamroller approaching from the east. Heinrich's attempts to explain these realities to Hitler, to obtain authorization for the kind of mobile defense that might at least delay Soviet advances and preserve some German forces for future need, were rejected with accusations of defeatism. Hitler insisted that will and determination could overcome material disadvantages, that fanatical resistance would succeed where professional military planning suggested only catastrophe. Heinrich was left to conduct a defensive battle with wholly inadequate means while maintaining the fiction that he was implementing Hitler's directives rather than doing whatever military competence suggested might delay the inevitable. The officer corps, more broadly, had fractured into several distinct groups by early 1945. There were the true believers like Schörner, who accepted Hitler's directives without question and implemented them with fanatical determination. There were the careerists like Keitel, who knew better but lacked courage to oppose Hitler and so participated in the charade while hoping to survive the collapse with their positions intact. There were the professionals like Heinrich, who recognized the hopelessness but continued fighting from duty, from oath, or from inability to imagine alternatives to continued resistance. And there were the conspirators, those who had concluded that Germany's only hope was removing Hitler from power and negotiating some settlement that might preserve something from total catastrophe. The July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt had decimated the conspiracy, eliminating many officers who might have provided alternative leadership and terrorizing others into silence. The purges following the failed bomb plot had created an atmosphere where even private conversations about ending the war were potentially fatal, where the Gestapo and SS monitored military communications for signs of defeatism, where officers feared their own subordinates might denounce them. The terror apparatus that Hitler had built to control German society was now being turned on the military itself, ensuring that even officers who recognized he was leading them to destruction lacked safe means to organize resistance. By April 1945, as Soviet forces began their final assault on Berlin, the gap between Hitler's directives and military reality had become absolute. Hitler issued orders for armies to relieve Berlin that had been destroyed weeks earlier. He directed counterattacks by divisions that consisted of scattered company-sized groups. He designated forces for operations that required fuel stocks Germany had not possessed for months. The orders were transmitted through proper channels, were acknowledged by receiving headquarters, and were then essentially ignored as commanders did what they could with the forces actually available rather than the phantom units Hitler believed existed. The situation conferences in the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden had taken on a surreal quality, with staff officers presenting reports about military operations while Soviet artillery fired on positions blocks away and the building shook from the explosions. Hitler would move colored pins representing divisions on maps, while the actual units those pins symbolized had ceased to exist days or weeks earlier. He would plan offensives while German forces were being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter around the bunker itself. General Hans Krebs, the final chief of the General Staff, found himself in the bizarre position of coordinating the defense of Berlin while also managing Hitler's increasingly detached relationship with reality. Krebs would receive reports from commanders describing desperate tactical situations, catastrophic supply shortages, and imminent collapse of defensive positions. He would then brief Hitler on these situations using language carefully chosen to avoid triggering rages while attempting to convey enough truth to enable some rational decision-making. The process was exhausting and ultimately futile. No amount of careful phrasing could change the fundamental reality that German forces were being destroyed and that Hitler's orders could not prevent this outcome. The junior officers and enlisted men fighting in Berlin's streets often had no idea that their commanders understood the cause was hopeless. that orders directing them to hold positions came from a leadership that knew those positions could not be held, that the sacrifices being demanded served no military purpose beyond prolonging the inevitable by days or hours. They fought because they were ordered to fight, because desertion meant execution by SS security forces, because they knew nothing else, or because they still believed the propaganda about last-minute salvation through wonder weapons or political miracles. The senior commanders who recognized the truth faced impossible choices. They could obey Hitler's orders, implementing directives they knew would accomplish nothing except getting more soldiers killed. They could disobey and risk arrest, execution, and danger to their families from Nazi retribution. They could attempt to surrender to Allied forces, an option that might save their men, but would be considered treason, punishable by the most brutal methods the Nazi regime could devise. Or they could continue the performance of command, maintaining the fiction that they were conducting military operations according to Hitler's vision, while actually doing whatever seemed least catastrophic given the hopeless circumstances. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, when it was encircled in the Ruhr pocket by American forces, chose suicide rather than surrender or continued futile resistance. Model's decision reflected the despair of a commander who understood that Hitler had led Germany to destruction, that further resistance served no purpose, but who could not bring himself to surrender or to continue sacrificing his soldiers in hopeless combat. His death was one of many suicides among senior German officers in the war's final weeks, each representing a personal solution to the impossible position of serving a regime that demanded sacrifice for a cause that was lost. The Western Allied commanders, observing German defensive operations in the war's final months, were puzzled by the continued resistance when military logic suggested that Germany should seek negotiated surrender. They did not fully understand the internal dynamics of the Nazi command system, the terror apparatus that made organized surrender impossible, the ideological commitment that drove some commanders to continue fighting, and the simple lack of any mechanism by which the German military could collectively decide to stop fighting without Hitler's authorization. Authorization that Hitler would never give, because ending the war meant admitting that his vision had failed. The Soviet forces converging on Berlin had no such confusion about German motivations. They understood they were fighting an ideological enemy that would resist to total destruction, that Nazi leadership would sacrifice everything rather than admit defeat, that the war would end only when German forces were physically incapable of further resistance. This understanding shaped Soviet operational planning, which focused on destroying German forces rather than maneuvering around them, on achieving complete military victory rather than creating conditions for negotiated settlement. When Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945, he left behind a military command structure that had known for months that he was leading them to destruction but had been unable or unwilling to prevent it. The realization had come at different times for different officers. Some had understood at Stalingrad, others at Kursk, others during the disasters of 1944, some only in the final weeks as Soviet artillery pounded Berlin. But by the end, the recognition was nearly universal among those capable of objective assessment. Hitler had not merely lost the war, but had ensured that Germany would be destroyed in losing it, that the wehrmacht would be annihilated rather than preserved, that German cities would be reduced to rubble rather than defended effectively or surrendered to prevent their destruction. The senior officers who survived to surrender to Allied forces, who faced war crimes, tribunals, and imprisonment, had to reconcile themselves with their participation in this catastrophe. Many would claim they had only followed orders, had done their duty as soldiers, had not been responsible for the political decisions that led to war or the strategic errors that led to defeat. But this defense rang hollow, given that they had watched Hitler lead Germany to destruction and had continued to serve him, had continued to transmit his orders, had continued to maintain the command system that enabled his decisions to be implemented even when they knew those decisions were leading to total catastrophe. General Guderian, who had survived his dismissal by Hitler and who lived to write his memoirs, reflected on the moment when he realized that rational military planning had become impossible, that Hitler had crossed some threshold into irrationality that made effective command impossible. For Guderian, this recognition had come in those final conferences where Hitler would rage at objective reality, where attempting to discuss actual military conditions would trigger accusations of defeatism, where the gap between what Hitler believed and what actually existed had become absolute. The tragedy was not merely that Germany lost the war. By 1943, if not earlier, that outcome was essentially determined by the arithmetic of industrial capacity and force ratios. The tragedy was that Germany lost it in the most destructive way possible, through leadership that refused to acknowledge when the war was lost, that demanded continuation of fighting long after any military purpose could be served, that preferred total destruction to negotiated settlement, that sacrificed millions of lives to delay an inevitable outcome by weeks or months. When the German High Command realized Hitler was leading them to total destruction, they faced a choice between their oaths to a Führer who had become irrational, their duty to preserve what they could of Germany and the Wehrmacht for whatever future might emerge from defeat, and their personal survival in a system that punished dissent with death. Most chose obedience, whether from conviction, from fear, or from inability to imagine alternatives. That choice, to continue serving a leader they knew was leading them to catastrophe, defined the Wehrmacht's final chapter, and ensured that Germany's defeat would be as complete and devastating as Hitler's nihilism and the High Command's compliance could make it.